The water hissed before anyone moved. Inside a concrete building surrounded by Texas mesquite trees, 50 German women stood barefoot on cold cement, stripped down to their underclothes, trembling in silence. The U.S. Army sergeant at the door barked an order through the translator. "Everyone inside! You'll wash before your uniforms are issued." To the Americans, it was routine. To the prisoners, it was a nightmare. One woman whispered, her voice shaking, "They're making us shower. Together." Another clutched the edge of her shirt like armor. "This is how it starts," she muttered in German. "This is how they kill us." When the pipes above them groaned to life, dozens of women froze in place. Their eyes darted upward, searching for the invisible death they had been taught to fear. Nazi propaganda had told them what awaited prisoners in the West: camps, gas, humiliation, extermination. But instead of poison, the pipes sprayed cold, clear water. The women screamed. Then one began to sob, dropping to her knees. Another started to laugh hysterically, the kind of laughter that borders on madness. A third woman pressed her trembling hands to her face and whispered over and over, "It's not gas. It's just soap." The sergeant at the door frowned, not understanding. He thought maybe the water was too cold. But the translator, a German-American corporal, realized what was happening. "Sir," he said quietly, "they thought we were going to kill them." The American took off his cap, speechless. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the older women, her hair gray and matted from weeks of transport, began washing her arms with the bar of soap they had been given. She looked at it, white, fragrant, ordinary, and began to cry harder. That night she wrote in her journal, "I never thought I would cry over soap. But when the water came, and it was only water, I knew we had been lied to our whole lives." The scene fades into the statistics that frame this forgotten chapter of the war. Between 1942 and 1946, over 400,000 Axis prisoners of war were held across the United States, Italians, Germans, and Japanese. Among them were a small number of German women, captured while serving as nurses, clerks, or auxiliaries in occupied territories. Many were sent to work camps in Texas, far from the bombed ruins of Europe. There were fences, yes, and guards. But what awaited them inside wasn't hatred. It was routine, order, and above all, dignity. For women who had grown up under the shadow of the Third Reich, a regime that worshipped strength and despised mercy, this was a kind of captivity they could not comprehend. One former prisoner years later told a historian, "When they made us shower that first day, we thought it was our end, but it was our beginning." The camera of history pans wide, across the red soil of Texas, the glint of sunlight on barbed wire, the distant sound of cattle lowing on open range. From that moment on, the German women POWs in Texas began an emotional journey few would believe. From terror to trust, from fear of death to rediscovery of humanity. And it all started with water and a bar of soap. The train rattled across the barren plains, its windows coated in dust and sunlight. Inside, dozens of German women sat shoulder to shoulder, silent, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. The war in Europe had ended for them, but their minds were still trapped inside it. They had been told this journey would end in death. Nazi officers had whispered before their capture that Americans treated prisoners worse than animals, that women would be starved, humiliated, or executed. Some believed they were being taken to forced labor camps in the desert. Others thought they would be used for medical experiments. As the train slowed near the small Texas town of Hearne, a strange sight appeared through the dirty glass. Instead of armed guards in black uniforms, there were men in wide-brimmed hats and dusty boots, cowboys. Some leaned lazily on the fence line, chewing tobacco. Others were unloading crates of bread, flour, and cans of beans from a truck. The prisoners exchanged confused looks. This wasn't the America they'd been warned about. When the doors slid open, Hot air rushed in, heavy with the scent of hay and cattle. The women squinted against the blinding Texas sun. One of them whispered, "Where are the whips? The guns?" Another answered quietly, "Maybe they're waiting inside." They were herded off the train, but the guards didn't shout or strike. Instead, a tall, freckled soldier in his 20s smiled and offered water from a canteen. "Welcome to Texas," he said in slow English, unsure if they'd understand. They didn't understand his words, but they recognized his tone. It wasn't cruelty. It was calm. A German nurse named Lotta recalled later, "He spoke as if we were guests, not prisoners. I didn't know whether to be insulted or relieved." The camp itself was unlike anything they expected. Neat rows of wooden barracks stood behind barbed wire. Beyond that, fields of corn, a mess hall, and even a small chapel. The guards were young Americans from Texas and Oklahoma, most barely older than the prisoners themselves. At roll call, one of the officers addressed them through a translator. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said. "You will work, eat, and rest. You are not slaves. You are prisoners of war, and you will be treated with dignity." The women stood stiff, still suspicious. They'd heard the word dignity before, always from men who didn't mean it. That night, when they received their first meal, white bread, soup, and real coffee, silence fell over the tables. A few refused to eat, fearing poison. Others tasted cautiously, then devoured everything. One woman, unable to hold back her disbelief, whispered to another, "If this is how they treat enemies, how do they treat their own people?" In the distance, coyotes howled across the Texas prairie, blending with the hum of crickets. The war felt far away, yet the fear still lingered. But deep inside, a new thought began to take root among the prisoners. Fragile, uncertain, but impossible to ignore. What if everything we were told about America was a lie? For these women, captivity had just begun. But so had the slow, painful unraveling of everything they thought they knew. Morning in Texas began not with gunfire, but with roosters. The German women woke to sunlight streaming through the slats of their barracks, the air thick with the smell of dust and pine. Instead of barking guards, they heard the clang of breakfast trays and the low hum of a radio somewhere playing swing music. They were alive. And more than that, they were being fed. The camp at Hearne, Texas, like dozens of others across the American South, had been built for efficiency, not cruelty. Barracks were lined in perfect order, their bunks stacked with fresh blankets and sheets that still carried the scent of detergent. The women had been issued clean uniforms, stamped POW for prisoner of war. When one of them asked through the translator if they could wash their clothes, the American sergeant laughed. "We've got soap, plenty of it," he said, handing them bars from a crate. "You'll smell better than we do." That single line, a joke in English, half understood through translation, sent ripples of confusion through the women. For years they had lived under a system where soldiers ruled with fear, not humor. The idea that a guard could make a joke instead of a threat felt impossible. In the mess hall, long wooden tables were set with tin plates. For breakfast, there were eggs, bread, butter, and a small slice of bacon. The prisoners hesitated again, remembering warnings that Americans poisoned their captives. But one woman, Lotta, the nurse from North Africa, tasted first. She chewed slowly, then began to cry. "It's real food," she whispered. Soon the room filled with the sound of clinking utensils and the murmurs of disbelief. One prisoner murmured, "They feed us better than Berlin feeds its soldiers." After meals, the women were assigned work details: sewing uniforms, cleaning, tending the camp gardens, or working with livestock on nearby farms. They were paid a small stipend in camp scrip, which they could use at the canteen to buy cigarettes, candy, or postcards. The discipline was strict but fair. Guards were trained to enforce order without humiliation. Any American soldier who mistreated a prisoner risked punishment himself, a policy that stunned the German women. accustomed to a world where power went unchecked. A Red Cross representative visited monthly, ensuring food quality and medical care. The camp doctor examined the women regularly, treating them with the same professionalism as American patients. Antibiotics, clean bandages, soap, things that had become rarities in wartime Germany, were abundant here. For the first time in years, many of the women felt their bodies healing. Their skin cleared, their hair grew back from malnutrition, their strength returned. But healing the body was one thing, healing the mind was another. At night, lying in their bunks, the women whispered to each other in disbelief. "Why?" one asked. "Why are they kind to us?" Another answered softly, "Maybe because they can afford to be." That sentence lingered. It wasn't just about money. It was about abundance, confidence, and something deeper. The women began to see that the power of America wasn't built on hatred or propaganda, but on a quiet, effortless strength, the kind that didn't need to shout. In the heart of a Texas POW camp, thousands of miles from home, they were learning a lesson their own leaders had never taught them. That true order doesn't come from fear. It comes from dignity. It began like any other morning. The women were told they'd receive new uniforms and medical checks before being assigned to work duty. The sun burned white against the Texas sky as guards directed them toward a long concrete building at the edge of the camp, the shower house. The German women hesitated at the doorway. The smell of wet concrete, the pipes overhead, the sound of running water. It all felt too familiar, too haunting. Many had heard stories whispered through Germany's towns and villages, of showers that weren't really showers, of water that never came. One woman, Anna, froze completely. Her knees locked, her face drained of color. "9," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not here." A guard called out, motioning them forward. "Move along, ladies, get cleaned up." Soaps on the bench. The translator, a German-American corporal named Meyer, noticed the panic in their faces. He understood before the Americans did. "They're afraid," he told the sergeant quietly. "They think it's gas." The sergeant frowned. "Gas? What the hell for? It's a shower." Inside, the air was cold. The pipes groaned. And when the first jet of water burst from the nozzle, half the women screamed. Some fell to their knees, others clutched each other in terror. One began to sob uncontrollably. The guards, startled, exchanged confused glances. Then the translator raised his voice. "It's just water. Look, just water." He stepped under a showerhead fully clothed, letting the spray soak through his uniform. "See? It's clean. You're safe." Slowly, painfully, the tension broke. A few women reached up, touching the streams of water like something miraculous. Someone began to laugh, the laughter dissolving into tears. Anna, still trembling, caught a bar of soap in her hand, bright white, perfumed, and stared at it like it was holy. Later that night, she wrote in her journal, "When the water came, I cried. Not because it was cold, but because it was only water. I realized then that everything they told us, about American cruelty, about their hatred, was a lie." Word spread quickly through the camp. The Americans hadn't poisoned them. They'd given them soap, towels, and clean clothes. For many of the German women, that single moment marked the end of years of fear, and the beginning of something entirely new. Trust. When they emerged from the shower house, their hair damp, their new uniforms crisp, a few even smiled. The sergeant who had watched the chaos unfold muttered to the translator, "They really thought we'd do that to 'em?" Meyer nodded. "That's what the Reich told them." The American looked toward the open sky, shaking his head. "Guess they never met Texans." From that day on, the showers became a strange sort of ritual, not of fear, but of rebirth. The women began to talk more, even to laugh quietly among themselves. The guards noticed the change. Less tension, fewer arguments, a calm settling over the barracks. And as one prisoner later said, "That water washed more than our bodies. It washed the lies from our minds." In that steamy, echoing room in the middle of Texas, the war, at least for those women, had truly ended. After the shower incident, something in the camp changed. The German women, once silent, guarded, and brittle with fear, began to lift their heads when they walked. The Americans noticed it too. The haunted look in their eyes was fading, replaced by something that looked almost like curiosity. The camp commander, a broad-shouldered Texan named Captain Harris, believed that keeping prisoners idle only bred resentment. "Work heals," he said, "and the land's got plenty to give." So when a nearby cattle ranch requested help with feeding and fence repair, he agreed to send a group of the women, under light guard, to assist. When the truck pulled up to the ranch, the women were stunned. The wide, rolling fields seemed endless. Cattle dotted the horizon, and there, waiting for them, were cowboys in dusty jeans and sweat-stained hats, leaning casually against fence posts like they'd stepped out of another world. One of the cowboys, a young man named Luke, tipped his hat and said in a slow Texas drawl, "Y'all ever seen a horse before?" The translator relayed his words, and the women nodded cautiously. One replied, "Only from far away." Luke grinned. "Well, let's fix that." Within minutes, the cowboys were showing them how to hold reins, how to brush the horses, how to calm them with a soft voice and a steady hand. The women watched with a mix of awe and disbelief. Horses, in Germany, were for soldiers or officers, not for prisoners, not for women. Yet here these Americans treated them as people first and captives second. One woman, Elise, hesitated near a chestnut mare that towered over her. "She'll bite me," she said. Luke chuckled. "Not unless you give her a reason." He handed her the reins, guiding her hand. "Easy now. She can smell fear." When the mare nuzzled her palm instead of biting, Elise froze. Then she laughed, a soft, shocked laugh that drew smiles even from the guards. By midday, several women were brushing the horses with quiet concentration. Some even dared to climb into the saddle. The cowboys watched, half amused, half impressed. One muttered, "They ain't bad for beginners." For the German women, it was the first moment of freedom they'd felt since before the war. The endless sky, the creak of the saddle, the smell of leather and hay. It was intoxicating. For a few precious minutes, the barbed wire fences and the ghosts of the past disappeared. After the day's work, the cowboys shared their lunch, cornbread, beans, and bacon. The prisoners hesitated again, not sure if they were allowed to eat with their captors. But Captain Harris gestured for them to sit. "Ain't no harm in breaking bread," he said. They ate together under the blazing sun, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. That evening, when the truck carried them back to camp, the women were quiet, not from fear, but from something like wonder. Lotta whispered, "They let us ride horses. They trust us." Anna replied softly, "And we didn't try to escape." That night, a new kind of silence filled the barracks, peaceful, reflective, almost holy. The women no longer spoke of death or vengeance. They spoke of horses, the kindness of cowboys, and the strange, healing power of the open Texas sky. In their hearts, the fences of the camp were still there, but they no longer felt like prison walls. The days in the Texas camp began to follow a rhythm, the kind of rhythm that feels less like confinement and more like life finding its balance again. Wake-up call at dawn, roll call, breakfast of bread, jam, and coffee, then work assignments, the steady, simple kind that gave the hands something to do and the mind something to rest on. Some women were sent to the laundry where they scrubbed uniforms and hung them to dry under the sharp Texas sun. Others worked in the gardens, tending to rows of tomatoes and okra. A few were assigned to the nearby ranches, cleaning stables, gathering eggs, and milking cows. The pay, 5 cents an hour in camp scrip, seemed trivial, But the act of earning it mattered more than the money itself. For the first time since their capture, they had purpose again. One woman, Helga, a teacher before the war, wrote in her diary, "We are working, but it does not feel like punishment. They do not beat us. They thank us." The Americans seem to believe that labor makes us human, not lesser. That idea astonished them. Back home, work had been a weapon of control, a measure of loyalty, obedience, and usefulness to the Reich. Here in Texas, work was dignity. Every completed task was acknowledged. A well-cleaned stall, a row of vegetables neatly picked. These things earned nods, smiles, even respect. One morning, as the women gathered tools, a young sergeant named Miller leaned against the fence, watching them. He was no older than 21, but he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up on land that taught him patience. "You know," he said to the translator, "they work better than most farmhands I've had." When the remark was translated, some of the women smiled for the first time. Compliments had become rarer than freedom in their old world. The turning point came when Captain Harris announced that prisoners could use their earned scrip at the camp's small store. It stocked basics: soap, writing paper, candy, and even Coca-Cola. When the women saw the bottles, their eyes widened. In Germany, Coca-Cola was a myth, a rumor of luxury from across the sea. Lotta bought one, turning the cold glass in her hands like a relic. She took a sip, her face tightening at the fizz, then softening into an expression that no one could quite describe. Later, she wrote in her diary, "It tasted like something forbidden, not because it was American, but because it was happiness." The guards, too, began to change. They saw not enemies, but people who laughed, blushed, and worked hard. Some shared cigarettes after shifts. Others, on rare evenings, played harmonica tunes by the fence, and the women hummed along quietly in the dark. The fences still stood. The signs still read POW. But in the spaces between duty and decency, something invisible had started to erode the walls. A kind of mutual recognition that neither uniform nor accent could erase. Helga captured it best in a letter that never reached home. "We were told that Americans were barbarians. But here they teach us that strength does not shout. It listens." It was in the soil, in the air, in every shared task. Texas was changing them, not through chains or orders, but through ordinary humanity. By autumn of 1944, the air in Texas had cooled. But the women in the camp carried a different kind of weight, the silence that comes from waiting for news that may never arrive. The Red Cross had begun allowing prisoners to send and receive mail. Each woman was permitted 2 letters a month, written neatly on standard forms, censored for military details but still heavy with emotion. The first delivery arrived on a dry, windy afternoon. A guard rolled in a mail cart and began calling out names from a list. The women stood in rows, faces tight with hope and fear. "Schneider, Lotta." She stepped forward, trembling as she took the envelope. The handwriting was her husband's, slanted, strong, unmistakable. She turned away before opening it, clutching it to her chest like a sacred thing. Others weren't as lucky. For many, there was no letter. The guards avoided their eyes. The unspoken truth hung in the air. Silence from home often meant there was no home left to write from. That evening, after dinner, the women sat by the barrack windows, reading under the weak glow of a single bulb. Some laughed softly through tears at familiar phrases. "Our little garden still stands," or "Your sister found sugar again." Others sobbed quietly, their letters trembling in their hands. Lotta read hers 3 times. Her husband had written, "They tell us the Americans are devils, but if they captured you, I pray they treat you kindly. Remember, the war cannot last forever." She folded it carefully and whispered to no one, "They treat us better than I dared to imagine." Helga, the teacher, received a letter from her parents in Dresden. It was short. 10 lines, the last one smudged as if written in haste. The nights are long. The sirens never stop. We hope you are alive. She didn't know that within 6 months, Dresden would burn. For those who had no letters, the camp became their only world. Work, meals, the rhythm of chores, these things kept despair at bay. Yet even within the barbed wire, life found ways to grow. Some women taught each other English. Others painted small watercolors of the ranches and the sky. They shared recipes from memory: apple strudel, potato soup, even though the ingredients existed only in dreams. One night, during a rainstorm, Captain Harris passed by the women's barracks and heard a faint melody. The prisoners were singing. It wasn't a German military song, but a hymn. Soft, steady, almost a lullaby. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. The next day, he ordered more art supplies for the camp. "Let them create," he told his men. "It's better than letting them remember too much." The small gestures, the chance to write home, to sing, to draw, became their survival. For women who had once been used as tools of propaganda, Texas had given them something radical: the right to be human again. And though they didn't know it yet, the letters, the songs, and the faint hope they carried would one day outlast the Reich that had sent them to war. Lotta wrote in her final letter of the year, "If we ever return, we will tell our children that even in defeat, we met kindness. That is the memory I will keep. Not the war, but the mercy." Christmas came to Texas quietly that year. The war was still raging across Europe, but in the heart of the Lone Star State, snowflakes drifted down over the POW camp like an afterthought of peace. For the German women prisoners, it was the first Christmas away from home, the first one without family, churches, or the familiar carols echoing through bombed streets. But that morning, something strange began to happen. The American guards were busier than usual. Crates were being unloaded, tables were being dragged out, and the mess hall smelled different, richer, warmer. The air filled with the scent of roasted meat and coffee. The women exchanged puzzled looks. When the bell rang for lunch, they filed in as usual, but stopped dead at the doorway. The long tables were covered in white cloth. On each plate sat turkey, mashed potatoes, and even slices of pie. Someone had strung up garlands of pine along the rafters, and in the corner, a battered gramophone played a familiar melody. Stille Nacht. Silent night. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lotta whispered, "They remembered." Captain Harris stood near the front of the room, hat tucked under his arm. "Ladies," he said through the translator, "today's Christmas. War or not, that still means something. So, no work today. Just food, music, and peace." The women stared, speechless. Then, slowly, they began to take their seats. Some bowed their heads, murmuring prayers. Others just stared at the feast before them, unsure if they were allowed to touch it. It was one of the cowboys, Luke, the same young ranch hand who'd helped them with the horses, who broke the silence. He raised a mug of coffee and said, "Merry Christmas, ma'am." The translator repeated it, and a few women smiled faintly. One lifted her cup in return. When the first fork scraped against a plate, the spell broke. Laughter followed, quiet at first, then freer. For the first time since capture, the women ate until they were full, the room filled with warmth, music, and the soft murmur of German voices blending with American drawls. Halfway through the meal, a surprise arrived. A small Christmas tree, hauled in by a pair of soldiers who'd borrowed it from the local town. It was decorated with bits of tinsel, buttons, and ration card paper stars. Someone placed it near the window, where the light hit it just right. One of the guards produced a harmonica, another an old fiddle. Before long, the camp echoed with the unlikeliest of sounds, Germans and Americans singing together, First Silent Night in German, then Jingle Bells in English. By the time they reached the second chorus, no one cared about the words. Helga later wrote in her diary, "That night I saw the enemy share their bread with us. I saw men who could have hated choose instead to sing. I think that was the first time I truly believed the war could end." When the meal ended, Captain Harris simply said, "You'll remember today more than any victory." He was right. In the years to come, the German women would recall that Christmas not as prisoners of war, but as guests of humanity, where kindness crossed language, faith, and fences. And long after the last note of Silent Night faded, one truth remained. Mercy had done what bullets never could. By the spring of 1945, the Texas winds carried whispers of an ending. The newspapers, which sometimes reached the camp through the guards, were filled with words like collapse, Berlin, and unconditional surrender. The German women read them in silence, their eyes scanning headlines that spelled the death of everything they had once believed in. When the radio finally announced it, Germany had surrendered. The camp froze. It was May 8th, 1945. The guards removed their hats. A few of the prisoners began to cry, not from joy or grief alone, but from the hollow confusion of having nowhere left to belong. Lotta stood outside the barracks, staring at the Texas sky. "It's over," she whispered. Anna, beside her, asked, "Then why does it still hurt?" Captain Harris called the camp together. "Ladies," he said quietly, "your country has surrendered. The war is done. You're safe now." His voice cracked slightly at the last words, not out of pity, but out of relief. For both sides, it had been a long, brutal road. That night, the German women didn't sing. They sat by the fence, watching the stars. In the distance, the cowboys' voices carried faintly from the ranch. Laughter, music, the sound of a world still moving forward. For the prisoners, time had stopped. Some of the women felt shame, not for losing, but for realizing how much they had misunderstood. For years, they'd been told that America was soulless, mechanical, greedy. But here, in a land of endless sky and hard labor, they'd seen something different. A country that fought fiercely, but without hatred, that believed order could coexist with mercy. In the following days, the Americans allowed the prisoners more freedom within the camp. There were no celebrations, no banners, just small acts of gentleness. Guards shared cigarettes and candy. A Red Cross truck brought extra soap, fresh uniforms, and paper for letters. The women wrote home, many for the first time since capture. "Mother," one letter read, "do not fear for me. The Americans treat us better than our own did. They are not monsters, they are men, and they have souls." For some, the realization broke them more than defeat itself. Helga, the teacher, sat outside one morning sketching the camp's fences. When a guard asked what she was drawing, she said, "Freedom. I just haven't decided which side of the wire it's on." Weeks later, the orders came. Repatriation. The women would be sent home. As they boarded trucks bound for the coast, Captain Harris and a handful of cowboys stood by to see them off. One of the women handed him a small handkerchief embroidered with red thread. "For kindness," she said in halting English, "for freedom." He nodded, tucking it into his jacket pocket. "You'll be all right," he told her. When the trucks rolled away, dust trailing behind them, the camp seemed emptier. Not because the prisoners were gone, but because something invisible had lingered behind. A strange bond, forged through compassion in a place built for captivity. That night, Captain Harris walked the silent grounds, the handkerchief still in his pocket. He looked at the empty bunks, the showers, the horses grazing in the distance, and murmured to himself, "Guess mercy really does win wars." The journey home began in late summer 1945. For the German women POWs, The convoy of army trucks leaving the Texas camp felt like the closing of a strange, beautiful chapter they could never explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. They were thinner than when they had arrived, but their faces were different, less afraid, more alive. The Americans gave them each a care package: soap, chocolate, a small American flag pin, and a note that read, "Good luck, you've earned peace." Most tucked the gifts into their pockets as keepsakes. At the harbor, as they boarded the ship bound for Europe, the women turned one last time to look at the land that had changed them. For months they had been prisoners, but in the heart of Texas, they had been treated like human beings. Fed, respected, even trusted. Lotta whispered to Anna, "It feels wrong to leave, like we're leaving home behind." When they reached Germany, the contrast was unbearable. Cities lay in ruins, streets were rubble, families searched for the missing and buried the dead. No one wanted to hear about compassion from the enemy. When the women tried to describe the Americans, the food, the songs, the kindness, people turned away in disbelief. Helga wrote in her journal, "We returned to a country still at war with itself. They think we were brainwashed by luxury. But if dignity is a crime, then I am guilty." In the months that followed, the former POWs struggled to rebuild their lives. Some took work as teachers or nurses in the shattered towns. Others married, raised children, and quietly tried to forget the war. But none ever forgot Texas. Lotta kept the Coca-Cola bottle she had drunk from on her first day of freedom. It sat on her mantel for years, a relic not of victory or defeat, but of awakening. Anna, who had once trembled before the showers, kept a bar of American soap wrapped in paper. She told her daughter, "This was the day I learned not to fear the world." And Captain Harris, back on his ranch, kept the embroidered handkerchief in a drawer. When reporters asked him years later if he ever regretted being lenient with enemy prisoners, he just shook his head. "We didn't beat them with hate," he said. "We beat them by showing what decency looks like." In 1957, a reunion took place in Germany. A group of former POWs who had been held in Texas met again. They brought photos of the camp, the barracks, the horses, the Christmas tree. Someone began to hum Silent Night. Others joined in. By the second verse, the room was filled with tears. "We went to war believing strength was cruelty," one woman told a visiting historian. "Texas taught us strength can be mercy." Their words would never make it into the history books. But among those who lived it, the memory endured. A quiet proof that even in war, humanity can survive. And sometimes, in the unlikeliest places, even triumph. Because long after the battles ended and the flags changed hands, what remained wasn't hatred or glory. It was the memory of a Texas sunrise, a shared meal, and a handful of people who remembered that kindness, too, is a weapon, one that never runs out of ammunition.